Yeah, good morning, folks, and kind of welcome everybody along to the committee meeting this morning, to the 7th meeting of the Education, Culture and Culture Committee of 2013. Could I remind people to switch off their electronic devices, including the people in the public gallery, because they interrupt with the broadcasting system. Could I also welcome Mark Biagi as a substitute for the convener, Stuart Maxwell, who I understand is in Iceland at the moment. The country, not the frozen food store, I think. The first item on our agenda is to take evidence from the Minister for Children and Young People on the Children's Here in Scotland Act 2011, transfer of children to Scotland, effect orders made in England and Wales or Northern Ireland regulations 2013 in draft, in brackets draft. The item is an opportunity for members to ask any technical questions or to seek clarification on the instrument first of all. So if there's any technical questions or clarification required, they want to ask just now. Sorry, my apologies. I'm new to this job. Would the Minister like to make an opening statement first of all?
Yes, I would, Convener, and good morning, Committee, and I'm also joined here by Kit Wyeth and Gordon McNichol. So I welcome the opportunity to introduce this set of regulations made under Section 190 of the Children's Here in Scotland Act 2011. These regulations are the first of a number that will be coming before the Committee between now and June 2013, when the 2011 Act will come into force. The draft regulations will ensure that a child moving to Scotland who is already subject to a care, supervision or education order made in England, Wales or Northern Ireland will continue to have compulsory supervision and meaningful local support from the date of their arrival in Scotland. These regulations will largely replicate current arrangements for children moving to Scotland as set out in the Children Reciprocal Enforcement of Prescribed Orders, etc., England and Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland Regulations 1996. And the 1996 regulations have largely been overtaken in the intervening years and will be repealed in June. Under the regulations, a non-Scottish order will terminate and be converted to a compulsory supervision order under the 2011 Act on the date of transfer. What is new in the draft regulations is an early review of the terms of the UK order. A hearing will take place within 20 working days of a child's move to Scotland, and this will ensure that appropriate support and supervision continues and is relevant to the needs of the child. The UK order may include conditions such as attendance at a particular school or support service that are no longer relevant given that the child is now living in Scotland. These new regulations deal with the movement of a child to Scotland. To ensure that all Scottish children who move get the care and support they need, we have agreed with our UK Government counterparts to include the necessary measures in an order under Section 104 of the Scotland Act. That order will go before the UK Parliament shortly to ensure that the appropriate protections are in place from June. So in summary, Convener, the regulations largely replicate current practice, update terminology and listed orders. They strengthen the process by introducing the 20 working day review hearing, and they ensure a smooth transition with minimal disruption and change for children and families. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, and of course welcome to the meeting, and also to Kit Wyeth from the Children's Hearing Team, and Gordon McNichol, Deputy Director of the Communities and Education Division from the Scottish Government. Does anybody want to ask any questions so far? Neil?
Can I just ask, just in terms of children moving from Scotland to the rest of the UK, you mentioned legislation for that to be reciprocated. When is that likely? Will that be synchronised with this subordinate legislation? When is that likely to happen?
The 104, the 104 order requires that wasn't a distraction tactic, sorry about that. The 104 order requires us to move this bit of subordinate legislation, so it will be coming forth. It'll be coming shortly to the Westminster Parliament, and we don't. It comes into force at the same time because we need that for go live in June. So it's sequenced to make sure that it's smooth and the transition is as all it can be, and ensures that children going to England and Wales or other parts of the UK are protected.
In situations where a child, let's say in England, may have been using private providers for support services, and they come to Scotland and want state provision, is that covered in this particular?
Well, when they come here as well, because some of as I said in opening remarks, if some of those things aren't appropriate, it will be then the responsibility of the home, now the new home local authority, to provide protection and measures for that child, and that'll be kind of taken in by the 20-day review, which is new to this order.
Even if that child in England had actually not been using local authority provision, but had, parents had paid for it in private provision?
Well, you would have to reach some kind of balance there, but the 20-day review hearing will be able to take on board some of those issues, but some of those things within that order for that child may not be accessible because of the new place that child is living in. So that 20-day hearing is new to this order, and that will take on board some of those issues that may arise, and will allow the new home authority to make appropriate
what I'm driving
provision.
at is there wouldn't be an obligation on a local authority in Scotland to make provision if that provision hadn't been state provided south of the border.
Well, it would be under the 20-day hearing review, would be able to kind of look at the needs of the child and make sure that best the appropriate measures are taken to ensure the well-being of that child is paramount. And of course, this is what the whole driving force of the Children's Hearing Service is, to make sure the best needs of the child are met, and that 20-day hearing will allow that to be seamless and that transition to be smooth.
Okay.
No issues with the process. It looks fine. It refers in the policy note under the consultation indicates there have been 5 responses, and the result of that kind of redrafting to take account of comments made. Just out of interest, it'd be helpful to know what those areas of concern were.
I think they were just generally minor technical amendments, so there was nothing substantive that came from that. However, it was a useful process, and it was technical and minor details that were changed.
Okay.
Okay. Can I now invite the Minister to speak to and move motion S4M 05714?
The regulations.
Any comments from members? No. Can I ask that motion S4M 05714 be agreed to? Are well agreed? Agreed. Okay, thank you. Suspend for a minute or two. Okay. Our next item is an evidence session on our inquiry into decision making on whether to take children into care. The purpose of today's session is to inform how the committee can best add value through the remainder of the inquiry, by building on rather than duplicating relevant work carried out by other bodies. The bodies given evidence today have carried out work in areas that are relevant to our inquiry. Can I welcome to committee Claire Burns, Strategic Policy Implementation Manager, and Jennifer Davison, Director of the Centre for Excellence for Looked After Children in Scotland, and Darlington, Operational Director of Children's Services Action for Children, and Malcolm Schaefer, Head of Policy, Scottish Children's Reporter Administration. Can I invite questions from members? Okay. So, who was first on my list? Joan McAlpine.
Okay, thank you very much, Convener. Yes, the Scottish Government set out an action plan in response to the SCRA's 2011 report on care and permanence planning, and I know it included actions for Celsus and the Scottish Government. I wonder if you could give us some idea of how this work is progressing.
Do I need to switch on this? Or the mics are on? Okay. I oversee the work of the permanence team at Celsius. The team have been in place since September last year, and I think we're really hopeful about how things are going. We're currently engaged with 22 of the local authorities around permanence planning. I think one of the really positive things about the way in which the Scottish Government have responded is that we've had a clear evidence base around what was previously happening with permanence cases through the SCRA report, so we had a baseline to work from. We've had a very strong voice from the Scottish Government about what kind of improvement they've wanted to see, and a really positive response from local authorities around an acknowledgement that things needed to change around our permanence process. We've seen a very non-defensive response from them. They're saying, we really want to work with you, we want to work in partnership with you, we really recognise that this is an area of our work that needs to change. I think there's been a really positive response because they've seen the Scottish Government response being one of wanting to work in partnership with the local authorities, with the Celsius Change team, and in a kind of less punitive way than we've seen maybe down south in terms of wanting to see improvements in permanence work. We're very much running it as a change programme. As I said, we're currently engaged with 22 local authorities already, which has really taken us up to capacity in terms of where our team is at the moment. And we're working around some key strategic themes. We had a scoping phase whereby we had, particularly headed by LACSIG, we had an event for each of the local authorities around permanence work where we were engaging with people at a strategic, operational and practice level, really hearing what are the issues around for permanence work. The acknowledgement from everybody is there needs to be changes both at a kind of social work practice level around assessment and decision making, around the children's hearings and around court processes, and the team are very much taking forward those strategic themes. So we're working with colleagues in the Scottish Government, particularly Robert Marshall. We've got an action plan, a virtual legal team and a kind of legal action plan that's in place, which will look at, they're working on two things, a change in processes whereby we're looking at how we reduce the number of reports. One of the key issues that were coming up is there's just too many reports in terms of permanence work, reports for the children's hearings, reports for local authority reviews and reports for the courts. So one of the things we're looking at is how do we streamline that in a way that reduces delay, and also around workforce development for people in legal services, particularly in local authority, about how do you make decisions which relate to child development, which is something that in terms of legal professionals may not have had that kind of training or background. So how do you make decisions which are in the best interest of the child and keep cognisance of child development issues? We've met with key stakeholders around SCRA and the children's hearing to look at what is it we need to do differently in terms of training for children panel members. So again, we can look at how do they make decisions, better decisions earlier, which are in the best interest of that child as well. And again, very much looking with particularly social work departments around how do we streamline their services so that we can reduce delay and drift. So one of the things we're doing is to process mapping with them. What is their current kind of system for their looked after system? Where do we see duplication and how can we help them to reduce that? And again, looking at what is the evidence base around permanence, what do we know works well and what do we know works best for children. Another kind of key strategic theme is around concurrency planning, where we're looking to develop local consortia around, I don't know how much concurrency planning means that children go with prospective foster parents early on, even where there's a chance they may go home. But what it means is they're with the carers who they will stay with. So that's the kind of things that we're working on just now. So I'd say an extremely positive response from local authorities about our engagement with them.
Thanks very much for that very extensive answer. And how are you evaluating the work that you're doing, in the sense that when will you know whether it's making a difference?
Mm-hmm. I think we're clear about the fact that what we're doing in terms of the extensive work we're doing, we probably won't see a lot of the benefits for it for a number of years. But we've got a very clear evaluation policy in place. As I said, what the SCRA report gave us was a baseline to work from. We actually have a researcher within the team who has a remit around evaluation particularly. So for each of the local authorities that we're going into, what we're doing is we're starting with a baseline about where they are with their permanence processes and giving them clear kind of milestones that we're looking for, and we're evaluating against that. So there's a constant process of evaluation going on. It's very much built into the improvement plan that we're working from. We've also taken quite a lot of the methodology from the improvement guide that they're using for the early years collaborative. So we're working alongside that as well, which is about how do we consistently test out some of our assumptions around improvement and constantly build those in, test them and constantly build them in. Thanks very much.
May I just add one more thing in terms of that? In our evaluation, we're making sure that we're identifying what the proxy measures would be for long-term outcomes for children and families. So while we may not see the long-term effects of children and families for the short-term nature of the project team that we have identified key systems changes that clearly would be a proxy measure for longer-term impact on children and families. So those are things that we are tracking and measuring as we go.
So you've identified them, so when will they be actioned by the Scottish Government?
I'm perhaps maybe not making myself clear. I think these aren't measures that the government needs to act on. These are systems changes within local authorities.
Okay.
And very small changes, for example, that will make a significant difference to the way in which, for example, social work might be delivered. So helping to support a department to establish a tracking system to identify when there might be any delay and make sure that that's done very swiftly and ensure that there's independent review of these in a ruthless way. Simply those proxy measures, if they weren't in place before, establishing those measures we know will improve delay and drift in relation to some of the care planning.
Claire Burns, I wonder, could I ask, you mentioned that there's tremendous progress, very encouraging progress in 22 out of the 32 local authorities, and you indicated that you didn't have the staffing capacity at the moment to deal with the other 10 local authorities. Could you just tell us how you selected the 22 and what does happen in terms of the remainder?
I mean, I think some of the local authorities are not ready, are saying to us, I've had an initial engagement with us and saying, could we maybe work with you next year, you know, once we've actually prioritised what we want to do with permanence. So it's really been the local authorities who have approached us initially. That's how we've chosen them. Some local authorities we're engaged with the local authorities who also have the biggest number of looked after young people. So, you know, we're engaged with local authorities who are saying we have the most significant issue here and we have the delay. So particularly in some of the bigger cities, Dundee, Glasgow, Edinburgh, they're very much engaged with us. What we're also trying to do, and we recognise as an important part, is to, as I was saying, is to try and establish local consortia, particularly around children who are going to foster carers or adoption. Because what's been happening previously is the local authorities have tried to deal with that on their own. So you might have a foster carer or an adoptive where there's a young person who could be matched from another local authority, and that might not have been happening. So where we might only at the moment be working with 22 local authorities, what we are working towards is trying to get local authorities to work together better, to share their resources so that we can move young people on.
So what time scale do you think you'd have all 32 engaged in some way? I mean, are we talking a year or 2 years or...?
I think it depends on the needs of the local authority, because some local authorities have a less of a need in terms of the process planning, but the way in which we're engaged with them is that we're also developing local practice exchange workshops so that local authorities where there's good bits of practice can share those with others. So we might not be engaged with them directly in terms of process mapping for them or looking at but we are engaged with them in terms of providing information about what's good practice, providing evidence base for them, looking at their assessment process. So I would say there's not local authorities who are not engaged with at all, because they're engaged with us in terms of being able to us producing materials or producing good practice guidance. But there's only 22 who we're directly involved in looking at their systems at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Answer this in response to Lizzie's question, but just for clarity, I mean, you're not looking at, through the testing and evaluation, to be running pilots all over the place. I mean, it's about working with each of the individual local authorities and trying to establish their needs and provide then a consistency of approach across all of the local authorities. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So we're not looking at establishing pilots. We're looking at each system to ensure that we understand how that functions and where the weaknesses might be, where the sticking points might be in a process, and help to feed back that information. and that will vary from one local authority to another to some extent, but the lessons that we're learning from each, we would then be bringing into the work of the next local authority.
The intention be to try and accelerate the process where there's more work to be done now, but where in order to provide that consistency, you would hope to be a process of catch-up, or are you simply going to have to acknowledge that there will be those that will continue perhaps to lag a bit behind other local authorities?
I think perhaps it might be useful to elaborate a bit more on our what we mean by partnership and the way we work alongside local authorities. So it's important, I suppose, for us that we've been really clear that we're not going in to do the work within the local authorities. We're doing the work alongside them. So the initial work of helping them to identify what needs to change and to help strengthen their self-evaluation capacity, it may mean that we can step out of the process or be less involved in a process as they take things forward. So I would hope that we can be engaged in a way that doesn't allow local authorities to lag behind, particularly with the inspiration of how other local authorities are taking things forward.
Thanks.
I was just going to ask, in terms of the point about child neglect, there's been a couple of reports produced by Action for Children and the University of Stirling regarding this issue, and I just wanted to maybe ask Action for Children what your views are on how the issues that were identified in the report are being addressed.
I think the development of GIRFEC and the Child's Plan has been very useful in focusing all the agencies on the needs of children in a more coherent way than we had previously. It's still not as comprehensive in every area, in every local authority area, but it is coming. We're starting to see much more joined up working across agencies. Neglect is a very it's a very complex area because, you know, as we've said in the report, not everyone sees it in quite the same way. And so there are various toolkits that we're using in training, both ourselves and other organisations, to help staff identify what neglect is, what is good enough parenting, and when it's identified to be not good enough, what measures we can take to intervene. And there is a lot of multi-agency and collaborative working going on to try and help us make early identification, provide the kind of services that help parents to understand what good enough parenting is, and then ultimately, if they can't reach those, if they can't manage to parent adequately, then try and make more effective and more swift measures to intervene and sometimes remove children. And some of our work is around doing assessments to help local authority social workers decide that it is time that children are removed.
And what do you think are the most difficult issues that you've identified that are the most difficult issues that are to resolve?
I think physical neglect is something that can be resolved by helping people understand what it means and how you can improve the circumstances within your home and how you're physically caring for your child. But emotional neglect is much more challenging. Especially where you have parents who perhaps have themselves had very poor experiences of parenting, and it's difficult for them to understand what providing an emotionally or providing an emotionally safe environment for your child is, because some of them have had no experience of that themselves. So a lot of the work that we do is about trying to nurture parents to some extent, but you have to keep the focus on the child all the time. I mean, one example I remember from my own practice is a parent who held her baby always facing away, you know, so the baby was looking out at the world and not looking at the parent, and trying to help her understand that the attachment that she needed to form with her baby meant that making eye contact and talking and those very basic things that needed to be done. And for some parents, that's very difficult for them to understand because it's outside their experience.
Can I also ask, in terms of one of the things I think has kind of been raised with me is that in terms of identifying child neglect, there's sometimes different thresholds amongst professional groups as to when to act, and that can be within schools, or it can be in social worker departments. Yes. Are there any, things that we should be doing in terms of training or looking at that on a national level with regards to kind of having...
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that some of the work that's starting to happen through the collaboratives, the early years collaboratives, is going to help in a large way towards early identification of neglect. I think multi-agency training has been really helpful in helping us all look at what the thresholds are and what's acceptable. There are still occasions when professionals don't agree that a situation is at a point where more intensive intervention needs to take place. But I think we are making progress in that regard, but it still isn't as coherent and joined up as it needs to be. And I think that perhaps what government can do is take a lead in encouraging all agencies and local authorities to train all of the staff who have the direct contact with families, because a lot of staff who have direct contact on a daily basis with families don't have the breadth of training. Perhaps they're not trained social workers, and it may be that some people only see children in a particular way. They may see them in school and see that they're not perhaps adequately dressed, or they aren't clean, but they don't know the circumstances at home. And I think that some of the work that we do in agencies like mine and in local authorities around work at home with families helps hugely in identifying what the real circumstances at home are. But I think definitely training for staff at all levels in identifying neglect and taking action, early intervention. And as I said, I think the collaborative is going to help enormously with that. But we also have children of an older age, beyond the collaborative is going to address particularly the needs of the early years. But there are children in the 5 to 11 age group particularly where we need to focus as well.
And can I ask also, a general point? We talked about consistency across the country earlier, and different approaches in different local authorities. And I just wanted to kind of ask. Obviously, we want to see kind of minimum standards in terms of intervening to kind of to resolve these issues. But obviously, there has to be an element of local flexibility and judgment in terms of professionals, and the issues facing areas like Glasgow, or the issues will be the same, but in terms of the numbers that councils like Glasgow are dealing with compared to others are often very different. So I just wanted to see what you thought in terms of the argument in terms of national consistency versus local flexibility and being able to respond to certain issues in certain areas, and how you think that can be resolved.
I think there has to be a balance between national standards for practice and that there's an expectation that everyone is delivering to a standard. But yes, local flexibility, because there are different strengths and different ideas in some areas. I've got a particular interest in rural communities, and it is quite difficult sometimes to deliver services there. In somewhere like Glasgow, you've got volume and a really high volume, and it's really challenging to deliver services there. But in rural communities, it can be equally challenging because you have the sparse populations. But yes, I think, and it's the same with the way the collaboratives are working, and I keep going back to that, because although you've got you know, the government has set a standard and everyone's working to achieve that. You've got your local leadership groups which are implementing it. And I think that, you know, that can be the same for all areas of practice. But I do think it's important that we have national standards that we're all expected to achieve.
Okay.
I mean, I don't underestimate the extent to which training is absolutely critical, but I think, as Neil was alluding to, there are workforce pressures as well. And I mean, it's often been suggested to me by constituents in Orkney that were they living in central Edinburgh or central Glasgow, they would never have come to the attention of social services and other groups. I mean, how do we handle that? Because that to those who feel that, in a sense, they're being treated unfairly, that the intervention isn't there to support them, it's to remove the child from their care. It's a very difficult argument to sustain. If you're saying, well, it goes without saying that were you in an urban setting, you very well wouldn't necessarily be facing the challenges you face, albeit that the child in question may be suffering as a result of that. How do we balance it, or do we simply accept that that's the nature of what we're dealing with?
I think neglect is neglect, whether it's in an urban setting or a rural one. And I understand what you mean about, you know, the kind of goldfish bowl that you can feel you're in a small community, where if you have agencies involved with you, you know, everyone knows in the community. And I think that in those circumstances we need to have huge sensitivity. But if we are working to the same standard, whether you're in an urban or a rural setting, then I think as professionals we have to ensure that the child is at the centre of everything we do. And if a child is neglected in any community, that needs to be addressed. But in the more isolated and rural communities, we have to have extra sensitivities to how that's experienced by the family. And it may be that you know, you use the more universal services to deliver some of the more intensive support. So it may be that through a nursery or a school or a health visitor that you're delivering those more intensive services, and you're not having, you know, the kind of blue light agencies going in. But nonetheless, if a child is being neglected, they still have to get the level of support, and unfortunately families will have to live with that level of scrutiny.
So you think it's perfectly not just possible but essential that you have that baseline in terms of whether it's neglect or whatever, that triggers the intervention. How that intervention is then delivered is a question of perhaps environment and what's accessible in terms of support. Right?
Yes.
Okay.
And if I could add, you would then look to the legal system if the intervention was needed on a compulsory basis to provide an objective standard of when intervention was required. That should apply, you know, in terms of a test of lack of parental care in any part of the country.
Particularly from young people who've been through the care system, they've mentioned how long it took for decisions to be made within some of their cases, and often several years, leaving them in a position where they felt much more damage was done to them had they been had a decision been made quickly. So really the question is about how we make decisions more quickly and good quality decisions. How can we start to move that? And that's a question to whoever wishes to answer.
I could start, if you like. Certainly in terms of the work that we've done, following the Permanence Report, we followed it up with research into children on supervision more than 5 years, which has again looked at some of the themes and tried to break it down into where delay occurs. We're going to be following that up over the next year by looking in more detail at the very initial parts of the system. Because while there's been a lot of concentration upon the court end, if you like, and delays that can occur there, if I go back to our permanence report, that very much underlined that some of the core delays were at the very beginning of the process about working out when to move the child on. So what we're trying to look at a bit more is firstly putting our own decision making under focus and look at when we take decisions, how long they take, what information we get that helps prompt our decision making and how we can improve on that. Secondly, looking at when are decisions taken to refer children to the reporter and referred to GovFEC in operation, and there's still an inconsistency in different parts of the country as to when that referral is made and triggered. So we hope a further study of that will help look at the very critical first element of the process and where improvements can be made, which can have a national significance in terms of referrals to the reporter and the reporter making decisions to move on. We do have within the hearing system a blueprint which looks at the different elements of the system, looks at how long each element takes, and allows us to see where delays occur and try to track them and build in improvements. And that's much along the lines of what's being worked in at the moment with the permanence area.
And I just, if I may add to this, the reason that delays are so harmful, really, if I could just take a moment to explore that with you, it quite often will then leave a child or young person in adverse circumstances that creates further damage. It creates additional and emotional and behavioural problems in terms of then what we're seeing in terms of the children's experiences, and ultimately then if they are brought into the care system, the stability, their ability to build connections and to attach well with their carers will be compromised the longer there is a delay. And so there's a greater chance of instability in relation to their placements and the likelihood of them being moved from placement to placement, and sometimes to more and increasingly more expensive tariffed placements, is a direct consequence to the delay that's caused. So if I could just unpackage that, in addition to the moral argument of young people saying to you that this is harmful, I think that the research will bear that out absolutely, that there's both a moral and an economic imperative to be addressing the questions of delay.
Within the system, you know, we've got all different elements, the children's hearing system, then there's criminal justice element, there's social, children and families, social work. Is it all too complex? And if it is, how can we try and, I mean, I know what we're talking about is trying to streamline that, but how can we, any thoughts on how we actually make that less complicated?
I think where systems interlink, it's looking at how efficiently systems interlink and how quickly decisions are taken. For instance, if there's a link between criminal justice and child protection, ensuring that the criminal justice element, while very important, does not delay any measures to protect children. So we work, for instance, very closely with Crown Office in terms of cases that have a joint interest to ensure that there's no delay caused by either end. It's also partially a matter of looking at the different processes that work and asking, do they add value? So when I was last before the committee, I suggested there were elements in the permanence process which possibly could be eliminated and which could reduce timescales. The permanency advice hearing, for instance, we would calculate takes an added 3 months on average, at least, onto the process. Now, does that have sufficient value to justify it being in existence? Or if we removed it, would it lead to speeding up of the process? And there'll be other elements of the process as well, which will be examined, I'm sure.
Liz?
Convener, I think one of the great difficulties that we have, and just to come back to your point, Mrs. Darlington, about the difficulty of defining neglect. It was put to us by 2 of the groups that we visited that sometimes where the suspicion is that there's really quite considerable neglect, but there's an unwillingness on behalf of the parent or the guardian to tell us about it or to tell the authorities about it. And I'm not sure, certainly from my own perspective, that we've got to the right level of questions as to how we improve this. Could you help us in our deliberations? What kind of questions do we have to be asking to bring out the number of situations where there is not an admission of the problem, and secondly, how we handle the very difficult circumstances where parents perhaps are fighting against the system. What do we have to be doing to improve that?
I think one of the things is to be absolutely explicit about what we expect for children, and not to be afraid to say this is what we expect. We expect children will be nurtured and loved and cared for in all the ways that they need to be. And I think for some parents, they don't really understand that. I don't think you can emphasise enough that there are some parents who have had such poor experiences themselves that they really don't understand that. And if we can find ways of engaging with them in a non-threatening and non-judgmental way, so we're not saying you are a rotten parent, but we're saying that, you know, accepting that parents love their children and they do want the best for them, but they just don't understand sometimes how to go about it. And I think perhaps as a society we're not always as open about the fact that children do need to be loved and cared for and have boundaries set for them. And we're not always honest enough with parents when they're not achieving that. And I think that one of the more useful things that we can do is actually see what's happening at home. So those people who are going into the home, whether it be health visitors or third sector workers or whoever it is, are going into the home because if there's any concern about the well-being of a child, we need to know what's happening at home, because you can, you know, feel that there's something wrong with the child, but you don't know what it is. And by seeing what happens at home and fully engage, and you're right, some parents don't want to engage, but I think that we have to be very strong and really honest with them about our concerns. Sometimes I think we wander around the problem rather than being as direct as we should be.
How significant in number terms is the problem where the parents are perhaps very articulate and able to play the system a bit? In other words, not admit to the problem and fight their own battles, really, playing off different people who are trying to help. Is that very significant?
It is fairly significant. It's not very, but it is fairly significant. There are a number of families who are able to present as if things are going well, and if they are challenged about something, you know, they can answer and respond to that very well. And that's a real challenge for us, because I think that, you know, there's an imbalance of power between people like us who work with families and the families. And if the families are living in fairly dire circumstances, somehow it seems, I don't know, we feel we've got some kind of moral authority.
Yep.
And I think that's something we have to question ourselves all the time. But if someone is presenting well, is articulate, is able to describe, you know, and challenge, you know, why are you asking? You have no right to ask. We have to be very, very strong and keep the child at the centre and keep on reiterating that there is a concern about the child and we're trying to address that. And it is very difficult, and there are numbers of, as you say, fairly articulate parents who themselves have some emotional difficulties, but are able to fend off agencies. And that's, I think, when we need to work as a team around the child, whoever it is, whether it's health, the local authority, the third sector, the children's hearing, whoever it is, we need to be working together so that we're presenting a united approach about our concerns for the child.
Thank you, that's very helpful indeed. Do you think it's a growing problem, even if it's maybe not a huge number that are involved in this? Do you think it's a growing problem?
I don't really know. I think it possibly is. I know one or two, anecdotally, one or two cases that my organisation is working with where you've got a parent who is able to present and articulate very well and who makes demands on services, but then when the services say, well, we have some concerns here, it's you know, I'm asking you, I'm telling you what I want. You're not going to tell me what I should be doing, and but that's only anecdotal. I don't know. I don't have any numbers.
Thank you very much.
I think what is a significant issue, particularly in children's hearing, is the number of parents who have legal representation at children's hearings now. So maybe not so much that issue, but we are seeing a much more litigious process within the children's hearings, which can be very difficult then for social workers to function with that, and also feeling that their assessment is very undermined by that process as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, obviously there is, you know, we shouldn't kind of say that child neglect just happens in certain areas and not in others, and clearly that's the case. I was going to ask you about resources and the targeting of resources. For example, we've seen kind of reports recently, even yesterday, a report on Scottish education calling for resources to be targeted at those most in need and those in the most disadvantaged backgrounds or areas. I just wondered if you shared that view.
Yes, I do. I do think we should target our resources on those who need it most, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't stigmatise. I think that's very important, that the child doesn't feel that they are being targeted because of family problems. You know, in some of the written work, you know, you've talked about children in school because they're looked after, feeling they're being treated differently, and I think that is hugely important. That yes, we target resources, but we try to do that within a universal setting. So is it that a child in school needs additional help? How do we provide that additional help without making them feel different to their peers? But I absolutely feel that we do need to target resources on the most needy, but within a universal provision as far as we can.
Could I step in to suggest, I think the GERFEC model does lead to an understanding of a targeting of services as the needs become higher. I think there's a real concern I would have about diminishing in any way an understanding of the role of the universal services. And I say that particularly in light of our conversation about neglect, and particularly in relation to a group of children who are neglected, who may be, it may be low-grade neglect, but it is the cumulative effect of that kind of perhaps low-grade neglect that long-term in their lives have a very, very significant and damaging effect. And these are children, for the most part, who won't reach any threshold for social work services to intervene. And so ultimately now we're looking at the universal services who will need to be strengthened to be able to address the needs of these children and these families to be able to meet the needs of the children effectively. So I think my hesitation around identification of targeted services is that we then will continue to miss these children who are being neglected in a low-grade way, but for whom the impact of that over a lifetime will be hugely significant. So I think targeting is just one small component of the answer, and actually strengthening universal services is a really important way to be able to address these needs of these children.
Yes, thank you.
Answered a lot of what I wanted to ask, but you did mention in terms of the rural services at the moment about the light being shone on the problem and it being like a fishbowl. Do you think that the targeting of services could lead to that being exacerbated for rural communities?
Question. I might see if Anne, who specialises in rural areas,
I think yes, you have to be very careful. If you've got a child protection concern, then whether you're in a rural community or anywhere else, it needs to be addressed. I think you can make things worse for children because they are in that goldfish bowl, so you have to have huge sensitivity. For example, some of the services that I'm responsible for in rural communities, we have staff who go out and do mentoring and befriending with young people, and that can and that's offered to young people through the local school. So it's seen as something that's quite nice to have, because you have an adult who is spending some hours with you every week, and people, other children are, you know, sometimes slightly envious of that. But it is a very difficult balance. But I go back to the point that you can't not do it. You have to do it, but it's about how you do it. Sometimes through local community organisations, maybe the local youth club or whatever is happening, you can put additional resources in. Sometimes, again, an organisation like mine or Bernardo's or some of the other volunteer organisations, we will add value into some of those services by being told, you know, there are young people having referral for young people who attend a particular thing and giving them more specific support, but trying to do that in a way, it's a bit like you would do in a classroom, trying not to identify that this is the child who's got the problem, you're helping the whole class, but you're ensuring that that child is able to participate in everything that's happening. When it becomes more difficult is when the problems are really very severe and children may need to be on supervision orders and have regular visits from social workers and other agencies, and that does become more and more difficult in rural communities. But again, you can't not do it. But sometimes what you find in rural communities is that the community is enormously helpful because they recognise that the family's got difficulties, and they will try and help and be supportive and encourage their children, you know, not to stigmatise the child who is in the family where they're having a lot of attention because of their difficulties. But it is a major factor in some of the work we do.
Thank you. Looking specifically at the decision-making process as to whether to take children into care, I mean, this committee has been taking evidence from a wide variety of witnesses. Are there any areas that you consider that the committee hasn't focused on or hasn't investigated adequately, or other areas where you think that we should be looking at that we haven't? Of course, that supposes that you've been following all the...
I have followed it very closely. I'd better say that very quickly. I think what you've found is that there's a huge number of areas that you've gone into, and almost it's trying to narrow it down to what are the critical ones. And certainly some of the questioning this morning has reflected some of the key areas that operationally we see day to day are the challenges. This whole issue of what's good enough parenting, which is the critical one in terms of emergency interventions or non-emergency interventions even in the lives of children. So I suppose a quick answer to your question is no, I cannot identify any area that you have not looked at that requires it.
I gave evidence at the previous inquiry as well, and I think there is an acknowledgement that I think Malcolm's point that further along we need to get much better at decision making, particularly for children where there's been a decision that they can no longer live at home. But what we've also got to be better at is to make sure that less children come into care, and that the ones who do come in are the ones that need to come in. And that's the bit that we're talking about earlier intervention and about the role of universal services. And I think Anne made the point that I think we're moving in the right direction in terms of what the Early Years Collaborative is doing, is it needs a response from community planning partners because it needs social work, it needs education, it needs health and its partners all to be involved in that. I think those are things that the committee has acknowledged that needs to happen.
Can I take it from the panel then that, broadly speaking, the committee's taken the right evidence on this, the right breadth of evidence? Good. Thank you.
Thank you. You discussed in detail some of the complexities, the number of agencies involved, the different geographic challenges in the process. But obviously I think there is a consensus that, as you just said, Claire, that we need to get better at this process. So I was just wondering what you think would be the appropriate action of the Scottish Government to actually drive change going forward.
I think we're going in the right direction. I think where we need to social work. I think there's an acknowledgement that social work cannot be the gatekeeper, cannot be the service that responds to difficulty for every family in the community. There needs to be a much greater response from universal services. I think the work again at the Early Years Collaborative is doing is looking at what is the response from community planning partners, and they're looking specifically at that we can no longer keep doing what we're doing. I think that's the really important thing about that's one of the principles that underlines the collaborative, is that the structure and the processes we've got at the moment are not giving us as good as outcomes for young people, looked after young people as we need, and young people in the wider community. And that the testing process is about saying we have assumptions about works well and we need to test those out, and then we need to scale up what we know works well. And I think those are really good principles in terms of moving forward. So I think that will be really important for managing the number of young people who are looked after. I think in terms of when we know that young people need compulsory measures of care and they need to move on, I think the Scottish Government needs, and I think they've done this through the permanence plan. I think it's been acknowledged that there needs to be changes and there needs to be action at different levels. It's not just about what's happening in social work, it's not just about what's happening in children's hearings, and it's not just about the court process. It's about changes to all of those, and it's about understanding how those are linked and making sure that the assessment and judgment at each of these stages are better. One of the things that we've been looking at is just about the role of leadership and scrutiny. We've been talking about the fact that there's delay in decision making, and we think particularly the role of seniors and team leaders at a social work level who are managing the staff who are working those cases, that those people are absolutely critical to improvement, because they're the ones that will say, well, you've been working on this case for 6 months, nothing much is happening, we need to move this to the next level. And we've been particularly looking at what the role of an independent reviewing officer might be within local authorities, somebody who can provide that kind of almost, along with the inspectorate, that kind of independent scrutiny about this case has been going on, this case has been going on for 6 months, what are we now doing about it, rather than it just rolling from review to review. And I think one of the things that Anne said that's really critical as well is that we need to be much clearer with parents about what our expectations of change are. That often what we do is we absolutely have to have a focus on the child. But I think one of the issues we've been looking at is how do we use contact, and how do we use contact more constructively in terms of our assessment. So saying to parents, this is what we expect will change between now and the next 6 months. You need to demonstrate this change. And I think often we've not been as clear or as articulate with parents as we've needed to be in the past.
May I come in
yes,
on that as well? I think it's a really big and important question you're asking, as you would ask as the committee, in terms of the role of Scottish Government. And from our vantage point at Celsus and in connection with colleagues around the table and others, I think we've seen that the difficulty here is the actual implementation of some of this change. It's not what Scottish Government has not done. It's about how we get the policy that is fairly sound. How do we get things changing on the ground, and how do we make sure we get traction? That being said, Scottish Government's leadership in relation, for example, to the question of permanence has been really essential in moving forward all of the implementation around that. And so if you were to be asking me the question, what now does Scottish Government need to shed the light on that will facilitate change in other areas to help support the change that's already happening? One area I would suggest is in relation to strategic commissioning. And I say that because, so first let me explain what I mean by that. Strategic commissioning is not, as I see it, procurement, but really an assessing of what the needs of a population would be, and then ensuring that those services are met for that population in partnership with service providers. So strategic commissioning relies on leadership within community planning partners and others. It relies on vision of the leadership, but it also relies on courage. And I think the courage will be strengthened if there's a support from Scottish Government to leaders to be taking some, I think, courageous decisions, for example, to stop delivering some services in order to be able to deliver other services. That's a very tough thing to do. Ultimately, that can be done much more effectively if there's very good data. And at the moment within Scotland, our data in relation to children looked after, and indeed children in need, is very weak. And so it's much more difficult to understand on a population level what are the needs of this population. And in a couple of years from now, looking back and saying, have we actually improved in these areas? Has this group of children actually reduced their level of distress? There are measures that we can use across the country to be able to measure that, and we're not doing that at the moment. And I think that would help to lay a foundation for very effective strategic commissioning to bring in evidence-informed practice and allow people to make courageous decisions to stop some services that may not be as effective.
Sorry, can I just ask, in terms of the data collection, I take it it's done differently within every local authority as well. Yeah.
Part of what's difficult about that is then there's no comparators. So we don't have a national comparator to say, you know, is the additional disadvantage that we see in one local authority compromising their ability to move forward in relation to this area because this area has been able to. So I'm not suggesting in any way leak charts or tables. I think there's something here just about understanding the needs of children in Scotland that we don't have quite yet.
Thanks. Just a quick supplementary in terms of what the Scottish Government can do. Claire Burns said earlier that one of the noticeable changes recently had been the use of legal representation by parents at children's hearings, and that's something that's emerged earlier in our evidence-taking sessions as well. And I wondered whether that was a serious concern to other members of the panel, and whether it was an area that they thought the Scottish Government should be looking at. And indeed, whether anything can be done about it.
Within the new Act that comes into force in June, the responsibility for appointing legal representatives goes on to Scottish Legal Aid Board. At the moment, legal representatives are chosen from local authorities who have a panel from whom they can choose. The essential criteria for appointing a legal representative is to support a parent who cannot effectively participate in a children's hearing. That's when the legal rep essentially comes in. And bearing in mind the sort of decisions that hearings have to take and their impact upon family life, it's a very necessary and appropriate step. And we may be able to think of examples where perhaps the legal representation has gone over the top, if you like, but equally there have been many very effective cases where the legal representative has been able to mediate almost and support work being done between the local authority and the parents. So I think we must, much as I like the thought of, or was thinking of the legal profession in bad terms, there's many good, effective examples of that. What Scottish Legal Aid Board will be able to do from June is produce a code of practice, which is already there, to ensure that there are expectations in terms of training, knowledge, behaviour, to enable effective participation, to monitor that, to be able to pick up bad examples. I think there is also a genuine issue for all agencies involved with the hearing system in being able to translate their knowledge into the legal system and be able to work effectively with it in terms of not being thrown by the questions that may arise from the legal profession, being able to present cases which often are very tricky and exemplified, and I absolutely agree with her, the difficult issues around emotional neglect, for instance, and actually producing a case, if you like, hard evidence of what that means, both within report and articulating it within a children's hearing and court. So there are challenges for professions in adopting to that, but we mustn't think of legal representation as being necessarily something that produces a bad effect. It can help inform the quality of decision making by ensuring a balanced view can be presented in cases where parents are unable to do so themselves.
You mentioned earlier that this legal representation tended to be for parents who would have difficulties, but when our earlier evidence session, I think it was someone who was in charge of social work in, how should I say, quite a middle class local authority who mentioned middle class parents who were neglecting their children and who were getting legal representation to challenge the authorities. That seems to be slightly different. Is that a problem in your view?
Well, that would be where parents are able to fund the legal representation themselves rather than having to depend on the legal aid scheme. And that happens. but the extent of it, I'm actually not aware of it as being a hugely significant issue, other than in individual cases it may be a challenge. But again, I would have thought the ultimate challenge for all agencies in that is ensuring that they actually feel confident in the quality of the information, the quality of the assessment that they have before them, so that it can stand up to legal scrutiny. And so it should, because certainly if my child was referred to a children's hearing, I'd be employing a lawyer and I'd be wanting to grill to prevent inappropriate intervention in the lives of a family.
Thanks.
Just to follow up on that, Joan's covered much of the ground I was going to cover, but I think, Claire, you talked about the risks of a more litigious process, and I think Malcolm's given us the answer that we got from Malcolm last time we tackled them on this. I mean, is that reassurance sufficient? I mean, do you think it's isolated incidents and it's about improving the training for those involved in children's hearing, whether they be on the panel or whether they be social workers presenting to panels, as well as the training for solicitors who are presenting to the panel? You're satisfied that the direction of travel there is one that won't become bogged down in over litigious arguments that are not focused on the interests of the child?
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that that's the way I think we're at an early stage in that. I mean, I think Malcolm's quite right to say, I think parents deserve to have advocacy, and they deserve to have legal representation if they need it in such a serious setting. I think what we're seeing happening, though, is that social workers feel that their assessment is often undermined by that process, or they don't have the confidence to be able to challenge that, and that's what we need. We need to work on the confidence of our social work colleagues. And as I think you're right, it's about that, and then it's also about saying that we need training and guidance for legal representatives around child welfare and about child development and what's in the best interests of that child.
Are there sanctions either now or as a result of the legislation coming into force later this year that would enable the chair of a hearing, for example, to say that after a suitable warning, that the behaviour of a solicitor, the way in which they're conducting themselves and prosecuting their argument, is out of keeping with the rules and requirements of a hearing? And therefore they can be excluded from the hearing? I mean, is that an ultimate sanction that's either available or would be helpful?
I have known in the past a solicitor be excluded from a hearing where it was just completely disrupting the proceedings. The danger of doing that is then you deprive that parent of effective participation, so it's not a step that I would hope would be taken lightly. But where the conduct was seen as being extreme and inappropriate, we're linking with the Scottish Legal Aid Board to discuss, well, what would be your expectation then, and would there be an avenue for the hearing to be able to report that back to yourselves in terms of...
But that wouldn't simply be in relation to those appointed to the Legal Aid Board. I mean, as Joan was saying, middle-class parents who can afford to fund this out of their own pockets would similarly be required to have a solicitor that would operate within the bounds of the hearing.
Sure. I mean, it's up to and I suppose that's an issue of confidence for the chair of the hearing and his or her colleagues in terms of being able to manage the process, and also that includes taking charge of legal representatives and how they conduct themselves, and ensuring that they conduct themselves within the spirit of the hearing system, allowing appropriate participation. And, they want to do it, and there's a dilemma can arise at court as well, in terms of you want to ensure that every party has a fair chance of putting across their case. So you want to try to control it. A good hearing chair will take charge, will interrupt if an individual, whoever it is going over the score, and try to do that. And in my view, more often than not, they are able to do so. But I think it is a work in progress, unquestionably, and there's more work that can be done on the confidence of all in terms of ensuring that the right balance is taken with communication with lawyers.
A central theme throughout this inquiry has been the view expressed that children and young people should be at the centre of the whole process, and that their views should be heard and should be taken into account. Do you think that this has happened during this inquiry? And if not, how could it be done better? What would be an appropriate and safe way to do that?
I don't know the detail of the young people that have been spoken to. I've read the report, and obviously there has been a lot of contact made with children and young people. I think there are organisations who are very good at helping young people represent their views. Organisations like Who Cares, for example, and I think it's all I think it's always worth engaging with those organisations in order to help facilitate the views of young people. I think one of the difficulties that you must have is about trying to ascertain the views of very young children. And that's an issue for all of us. You know, how do we ascertain what a preschool child, for example, thinks? And again, there are agencies and workers who could help with that, because the distress caused to children going through a process, whatever, you know, if they've been removed from their parents, or they're under a supervision order, or and they're attending a hearing, there's huge distress for them, and sometimes they don't participate because they just find it too challenging. But I think there are bodies who can help present the views of young people, or support them to present their own views. And sometimes they want to do it anonymously as well. They don't really want to speak to the likes of you and me, but they might do it in a way, you know, we've all had experience of them doing things through, you know, just talking over a DVD or something like that, so they're able to express their views. But it is incredibly difficult for them. And I think it is something that we should never stop thinking about. How do we do it better, and how do we ensure that their voice is heard and that we really understand what they mean, because sometimes they're in a state of distress and confusion and find it quite hard to articulate their views and their feelings.
And again, one of the provisions in the new Act is to allow the introduction of advocacy services for children that can help not necessarily people speaking for the child, but help the child speak for themselves. And the new Act very much stresses the participation of the child, and I think very much puts an onus on us to look at how we can improve the ways in which a child can participate in the hearing, that we can ensure that the views of the child are transmitted to the panel members, and that may be through a variety of different measures. And we should be thinking of all children, not just the older child. I absolutely agree with Anne that there's a tendency, perhaps at the moment, to exclude the young child from the hearing process until they're of an older age. We need to find a way of ensuring that any child who is able to articulate any view can have the opportunity to do so.
From the perspective of this inquiry, have we actually managed to gain access to the views of children and young people adequately?
If you ultimately, I think that's probably a question for the committee to make a decision. I'm not sure I'm in a position to be able to answer that, because I won't know fully how you've consulted. We would certainly be happy to offer you the resources that exist already of the many consultations that have been undertaken with young people about what their views are about the care system. And I would perhaps put in a plea that if you have, where you have consulted with young people, one of the important things for them is that they hear back how you've used that information, so that they aren't we don't necessarily need to hear that back, but young people who have been a part of the process will feel valued and appreciated and respected when if they hear immediately back from you the way in which what they've shared with you is being taken forward. And ultimately, I think that it's really important, absolutely, that we hear the views of children and young people. But also, we know what research has to say about child development, for example, about the importance of attachment, the importance of, in terms of the impact on brain development of poor attachment and neglect. And all of those things, in some ways, really is a collective understanding of what children need. And it's important that we hold that in our minds as well when we're making assessments about the way in which Scotland's looked after system is caring for its children.
Next item we'll be looking at how we take our evidence forward, and certainly the answers that you've given there will certainly give us food for thought in how we do that. Can I maybe ask a final question about, in terms of the, earlier on you said that the committee had taken the right evidence and we had, there wasn't really that much else where we had to look, but one of the things that concerns me, and I'm sure it concerns all of us around the table, is whether this inquiry will become just a bundle of paper that sits on a shelf, along with huge volumes of other bundles of paper that have probably been written about these subjects over the years. So what should we be doing to ensure that it's not just a bundle of paper that sits on the shelves and it actually means something for the young people who go through the care system? What would you like us to achieve? Now's your moment.
I think the way in which the inquiry was conducted earlier, when you brought partners who are working in the sector together to give feedback on some of the findings that you had, was quite a unique and forward-thinking way of helping us to own the issues. And I think ultimately it will not be a report that sits on the shelf if it's owned by those who are working with these children and who are responsible ultimately. So I suppose I don't have a precise example for you about steps to take, but I would suggest that the way in which this inquiry and your findings has life and spark would be to ensure that those who really do have a leadership role to take things forward have a sense of ownership of these findings in some way. So I think you're on the right track based on what you did the last time. Perhaps there's more that can be done in terms of persuasion and influence, as well as the strength of simply the voice of the committee, in order, again, to just reassert the ownership that needs to be held in relation to taking some of this forward.
Anyone else?
I think just in terms of what we've learned around permanence, I think is that the Scottish Government's very kind of strong response to the evidence, and I think a clear expectation about what they wanted to see happen within local authorities and the change that they expected in local authorities has been really helpful. So I think a very strong voice around what we want to see change.
Thanks very much. Anybody else want to raise a final point? No? Can I thank witnesses very much for their evidence this morning. We will, of course, keep you posted on how the inquiry develops, and if there's any issues that you want to follow up with us, then please do. The committee is taking its next item in private, so can I now close the meeting?